Shadow Hack. Chapter 391, Equalizer. System, do you really detect high-density flux energy in this region? Yoon-mu asked again. Yes. Then why wasn't it detected in Earth's true territory? The system was silent for a while, then replied with absolute certainty, because that place didn't have high density of flux energy. The system is certain of that. This reply was both good and bad news for Yoon-mu. According to the sea breeze whale's words about the special dimensional spaces which possess high density of flux energy, the system has determined that all of them have a few characteristics in common. First, there wouldn't be any dimensional beasts who had condensed their flux crystals in those regions with high density of flux energy. This would be because the large amount of flux energy would have assimilated with the dimensional space without any need for it to condense into crystal form. Second, it is highly possible that the origin of flux energy in such regions is the boundless origin world. Thus, the dimensional spaces which have high density of flux energy should all be in contact with the origin world. Third, the system has a suspicion that all the high-density dimensional spaces are also related with other planes. It is highly possible that the reason why they possess such a high density of flux energy is because they act as a medium between the origin world and the other planes. When Yoon-mu heard all of them, he found it almost inconceivable. He had no understanding of the information and data based on which the system had deduced this probability, but he had confidence in its ever-reliable nature. According to what you are saying, if this third point is true, then wouldn't it mean that there are many places through which one could leave the origin world? When Yoon-mu heard the third point of the system's analysis, he was shaken to his core. A day ago, he was still worrying about how to return to Earth. That was why when he heard the system's conclusion after detecting the high-density flux energy region, he was left stupefied. Theoretically, this point should be true, the system replied. Then how can you explain that within the past hundreds and thousands of years, no deity from the origin world has appeared on Earth? Regarding the question raised by the host, the system believes after having done a thorough analysis that it is definitely related to the most important hidden truth. It is definitely the reason behind the established equilibrium among the different planes. If sufficient information could be gathered, then the system could uncover the identity of the one who keeps the balance. Keeps the balance? You mean there is someone because of whom all the different planes have existed in harmony for so many years? Yes, but it is highly possible that they are not a human. It is also possible that they aren't a living creature. Because of lack of information, the system cannot determine the identity of the equalizer for the time being. The more Yoon-mu heard, the more muddle-headed he became. He was certain that the system had certainly gathered some important information and speculated based on it. But because the most crucial parts were missing, it couldn't unveil the enigma which was the equalizer. Thus, it didn't tell Yoon-mu everything. After all, that would only increase the pressure on him and make him even more confused. The system, however, existed to provide assistance to host and not to interfere equals. However, given his keen insight, Yoon-mu could still hear the trace of a threat in the system's tone. Suddenly he thought about the quasi-deities of the 66 planes, including the most wise ones from Earth, who had sent some people to scout the origin world. Otherwise, how could they guide the descenders? Without it, what would happen to them? Perhaps the last generation of descenders didn't go in such numbers, but there still should have been at least a few. Then how could there be no traces of them in the origin world? It was like they had completely evaporated from the land, and thus the new generation's descenders like Yoon-mu and Zhang Chuan couldn't find even a mention of their existence. The people of the origin world also hadn't discovered their tracks, not having any idea of the possibility of there being descenders. After Yoon-mu thought of that, he felt his heart go cold. Perhaps that equalizer mentioned by the system was someone who brought fear and trepidation to people's heart, the true bane and nightmare of the descenders. Brother Yoon-mu, what happened? Wang Yan suddenly discovered that his mental state wasn't okay and questioned him with concern. Nothing, I was thinking about some matter, Yoon-mu hastily replied. You don't need to be anxious about Zhang Yuan and them. Since we dared to bring outsiders here, it means we have already considered this hateful scenario. Wang Yan's face suddenly turned red, and she took Li Yoon-mu's hand in her delicate hands. Li Yoon-mu was startled, feeling the softness of her hands against his. He knew that she had definitely misunderstood, thinking that he was worried about Zhang Yuan, and so took the initiative to comfort him. Zhang Yuan occupies one of the front 20 rooms in our residential region. Li Yoon-mu's feelings were slightly complex. He didn't want to exploit this woman who treated him sincerely. That was why he had maintained a distance from her until then. However, Wang Yan's heart was set on him, and she was falling deeper and deeper. I know. We also know that his genuine strength is much higher than what he displays. But we also have our methods, so brother Yoon-mu should rest easy, Wang Yan said without any concern. Although Zhang Yuan was a noble, he shouldn't be feared just because of that noble word. The origin world was inexhaustible and possessed billions and billions of people. Naturally, the numbers of nobles would also be large, and their status was far higher than that of the barbarians. But if someone truly investigated their background and status, they would discover that there was a large disparity in status of different nobles. It was only obvious that those who would come to Blue Moon Island to gain experience wouldn't have any great background. That was why when comparing Zhang Yuan with Zheng Quan's group of 3 in terms of trump cards and reserves, the results were quite clear. From beginning to the end, Li Yoon-mu was never optimistic about Zhang Yuan's chances in battle. Chapter 392, Gigantic Coconut Trees. Li Yoon-mu believed that it was best for him to just sit and wait, having gotten an opportunity to observe the tricks of other descenders. Since both of them were from others' planes, he wanted to see how large was the difference between the two planes. Which plane was the more powerful among them? I won't worry. Li Yoon-mu didn't behave like a chauvinist, which would have made it more clear that he was afraid of Zhang Yuan, and changed the topic. What were you saying when you were interrupted by Luo Honghua? Brother Yoon-mu, I will explain this matter in detail after we return. Wang Yan's face turned completely red. I heard it quite clearly. You were asking me whether I would be willing to go to a completely unfamiliar region for you, Li Yoon-mu said. Wang Yan's eyes went wide, then she excitedly nodded. My answer is, what if I asked you to abandon everything and follow me? Li Yoon-mu suddenly smiled. This, why would you want me to abandon everything? Wang Yan was quite embarrassed. She felt quite confused, discovering suddenly that her understanding of Li Yoon-mu was quite low. After that, Li Yoon-mu didn't say anything more, dropping the topic. He simply stopped talking, leaving behind a bewildered Wang Yan. He knew that she would come to understand it sooner or later. Although he hadn't replied to her question, it was a response in itself. It meant a covered rejection. Li Yoon-mu didn't want to entangle himself too deeply with Wang Yan. Brother Yoon-mu. The dazed Wang Yan muttered those 2 words, but Li Yoon-mu didn't reply to her, instead walking forward in large strides to catch up with the main group. Seems like you still have some understanding of your own place. Wang Yan's status isn't something which you can hope to come in contact with. Although you are also a noble, people like you aren't worth anything in our eyes. For instance, that Zhang Yuan who's bouncing excitedly, see what will happen to him. At some point of time, Luo Honghua had come to speak to him. She could be considered as a stubborn person. All the time, she had been monitoring Wang Yan and Li Yoon-mu. By then, she was quite satisfied with Li Yoon-mu for understanding his own position, which made her feel quite relieved. She wasn't like Wang Yan who had lived her life like a princess and didn't think twice before developing feelings for a native. In her eyes, regardless of how remarkable or superior Li Yoon-mu was, he was still a native who would never be able to break away from his background. Although the people of the origin world were quite formidable, they were just country bumpkins when compared to their world where science and technology was developed. Besides, the natives like Li Yoon-mu could only be considered as somewhat outstanding at best. So who would put them in their eyes, apart from a stupid girl who hadn't experienced the world. Lee Yoon-mu pursed his lips and smiled toward Luo Hung-hwa, then stopped paying any attention to her, completely ignoring her existence. He couldn't understand from where came her sense of superiority, or for how long she would be able to keep it. Not that it mattered much to him, he soon forgot all about it. The passage of purple mist was longer compared to what everyone had imagined. After walking roughly 300 meters, they were welcomed by the dazzling sunlight. This is... When Lee Yoon-mu saw the conditions outside the passage, he was startled. Blue sky, ocean sand under his feet, large coconut trees rising up to cover the horizon, and in the distance, a large tropical jungle. Regardless of how one looked at it, this was completely like an island on his earth. In fact, for an instant, Lee Yoon-mu even believed that he had returned to Earth. It had to be known that the origin world didn't have any coconut trees, for there weren't many trees which were as delicate and defenseless as them. The vegetation of the origin world had an expansionist nature. There were very few trees which had a height lower than 30 meters. Not only were they extremely large, they also had methods to protect themselves and were filled with offensive capabilities. This was true for all parts of a tree, be it the trunk, the leaves, or the fruits. Usually, if one saw a sweet and succulent fruit, they would find that it was covered with thorns or perhaps some sort of poison. If a person without any knowledge tried to eat them, they'd die right away. It wasn't just Lee Yoon-mu who was shocked by the sight. Zhang Chuan and the other two descenders were also staring at everything blankly. Based on their reaction, the environment in Wang Yan's world was quite similar to that of Lee Yoon-mu's Earth. However, the true reason why everyone was startled wasn't this. The dimensional space possessed the characteristics of islands on Earth, which startled Lee Yoon-mu and other descenders, but the real problem lay in the fact that the coconut trees which were just too enormous. Compared to those on Earth, they were identical in appearance, but who could say how much larger they were? 10 times? No. 100 times? No. Those mother-asteriskers were at least several hundred times larger. When Lee Yoon-mu saw that each tree seemed to tear a hole through the sky, he couldn't close his mouth. He hadn't seen such gigantic coconut trees, let alone such enormous coconuts. The tree closest to them was 710 kilometers high and had the diameter of close to 200 meters according to Lee Yoon-mu's estimation. It was difficult enough to imagine a tree which almost tore a hole through the sky, but people would be even more shocked upon hearing about a diameter which crossed hundreds of meters. What sort of plant was this? Even if the trees in the ancient times were wide enough for more than 10 people to join hands to complete a circle, they were pathetic compared to the trees before the group at that moment. Suddenly, Lee Yoon-mu discovered more than 10 dried-up coconuts lying near the trees. Each one of the shells had a diameter of several tens of meters. Previously, everyone had mistakenly believed those dried-up coconuts to be brown hills. But anyone who carefully observed them would discover that they were just coconuts and nothing more. At several tens of meters in height, they were just coconuts which were larger than houses and nothing more. Spectacular, it really is too magnificent. What sort of tree is this? Doesn't it seem comparable to world tree grade? This place is really worthy of being called a legendary dimensional space. Such large trees and fruits. After seeing this, even if I didn't obtain any harvest here, I would still be satisfied. Compared to the shocked Lee Yoon-mu and Zhang Chuan, others, like Zhang Yuan, Lu Yanggui and Lei Jin, didn't have such fierce reactions. They were natives and knew that there were a number of trees in the origin world which were even taller than the ones in front of them. Chapter 393, Willingly Acting as Cannon Fodder. There were trees in the origin world which were larger than the enormous coconut trees in front of their eyes. They were the world-class trees. That was right, everything in the origin world was distributed according to strict hierarchy. In fact, social order was one of the most important principles in origin world. Not only were people and monsters as well as the ocean divided into different classes, even the plants and vegetations also had a rigid order. As for the world-class tree mentioned by Zhang Yuan just then, it was the highest grade in the world. The minimum threshold for a tree to be considered as world-class was to have the height of 10,000 meters. Only those trees who had attained such a height could be classified as world-class. Perhaps Zhang Yuan and the others hadn't seen a genuine world-class tree, but they had heard about them. Because of that, even if they were quite shocked when faced with such gigantic trees, it wasn't too intense. After everyone woke from the shock, Liu Yanggui looked at the people on Zhang Quan's side and said maliciously, "What should we do now? It wouldn't be good for us to enter this seemingly giant world without any information." Zhang Yuan understood his meaning and instantly said in a loud voice, "Situation isn't clear. We need information and it is time for us to do our bit. We will use old methods, you, both of you go investigate the jungle." He then pointed at two women who were still loyal to Zhang Chuan, which caused them to glare at him indignantly. "What? You don't accept it?" Lei Jun stepped forward from behind Zhang Yuan, full of killing intent. In the world, only those who had large fists could speak of reason. Confronting the killing intent of the other party, the two women didn't dare to say anything even if they were furious. At that moment, Luo Honghua stood up. "I have a suggestion. We can go investigate together. Given their mediocre strength, they won't be able to protect themselves." However, Zhang Yuan wasn't duped, he wasn't a fool. After all, the region had been discovered by Zhang Quan's group. It won't do. They just need to scout the region, so there's no need to send many people. Who knew how much they knew about the dimensional space? That was why he wasn't willing to allow Zhang Quan's group to disappear from his sight. In my opinion, if we also added Li Yoon-mu and Liu Zhong to their group, that would be better. There's no need for you all to go, Liu Yanggui once again suggested maliciously. All right. It won't do. Li Yoon-mu and Wang Yan spoke up almost simultaneously. Once Wang Yan heard that the other party was conspiring to harm Li Yoon-mu, she opposed it without any thought. But the person himself had agreed calmly. "Brother Yoon-mu, you cannot go," Wang Yan anxiously said. "It's all right. This island doesn't seem dangerous, and with me as well Liu Zhong around, they will also be safe." Li Yoon-mu didn't accept Wang Yan's goodwill. At that moment, he just wanted an excuse to disappear from the sight of the two descenders. Otherwise, how could they reveal the island's secret in front of outsiders? Although he didn't know about the dangers he might encounter, Zhang Chuan had dared to come with their strength. With that being known, why wouldn't Li Yoon-mu, who possessed absolute defense and many other trump cards, not dare to investigate the jungle? If he didn't even have the courage for this, then his descending would have been in vain. Without giving any opportunities for Wang Yan to open her mouth again, Zhang Yuan hastily said, finalizing the decision, "Good then, I think it's settled. Since Brother Li himself has agreed to this, you must be careful. Liu Zhong is quite reliable and a powerful person. If there's a problem and you two fight together, nothing should be able to stop you, so you mustn't leave his side." Desperate, Wang Yan walked to Li Yoon-mu's side and spoke to him in a quick manner. Throughout her barrage of words, Li Yoon-mu sighed in his heart. The beauty had developed deep emotions for him, but unfortunately they were people from different worlds. When looking at her, he didn't know whether to cry or laugh. There was a saying in his world, regardless of how smart a woman is, she becomes weak the moment she fall in love. In the heat of the moment, Wang Yan didn't seem to realize that her obvious concern would bring even more hatred upon Li Yoon-mu's head. Luo Honghua, who was standing behind them, actually let Wang Yan do as she wished. Clearly, she was quite willing to make Li Yoon-mu the target. If he could be harmed using Zhang Yuan's blade, that would be the perfect scenario in her mind. Then their group of descenders would regain its shape. Li Yoon-mu was fully aware of everyone's intentions. But he didn't say anything. After all, his principle was clear: this elder brother possesses absolute strength, so naturally I won't care about the plans of you two parties. You should also take care of yourself and not be careless. After reminding Wang Yan to be careful, he followed Liu Zhong and the two women into the jungle. Yes, I will be. Wang Yan watched Li Yoon-mu leave with an unresigned gaze. She was filled with hatred toward Zhang Yuan. When Li Yoon-mu's group of 4 entered the jungle, they immediately discovered that it appeared to be an enormous island. Everything on it was extremely enormous and even more enormous. Only when he personally experienced the feeling of entering a gigantic jungle did he realize what the scenery looked like. Ka-cha! Careful! Before Luo Zhong's warning could register, one of the women almost reached the gate of hell. Her clothes from left shoulder to rib were easily ripped open by a leaf, leaving behind a huge hole. If Liu Zhong hadn't pulled her away in a timely manner, then she probably wouldn't have escaped by losing just the clothes on the left side of the body. Instead, all of her left side would have been cut away by the leaf. That woman was also a noble, and had perhaps joined Zhang Quan's group seeing that they were also nobles. Li Yoon-mu recalled her name was Wang Ru. At that moment, her face was deathly white. How long had it been since they had entered the woods? In less than 10 minutes, she had almost lost her life. Her clothes from shoulder to rib had been completely ripped open by the tree leaf, because of which her supple left breast was revealed to everyone without her knowing. Li Yoon-mu's heart went cold after what happened. It seemed like they were indeed in an extremely dangerous dimensional space. At least for the initial and middle stage flux experts. The flux experts of the origin world were different from the fluxers of Earth. As long as the latter cultivated to the ordinary crystal layer, they would be able to congeal a crystal armor with the flux energy crystals, which would greatly boost the defenses of their body. Chapter 394, Grass Blades. Flux experts were different. Their physical strength was pretty good, so they didn't need to congeal armor. That was why they wouldn't do it before reaching consummate layer. It would be when they had stepped into the peak layer and could cultivate the great flux master layer at any time. Only at such a point would they create a flux expert crystal armor. Flux binding pills, which were of great usage to flux experts of the origin world, would be used for that. As for using them for cultivation, not all flux experts came from a rich family nor were like Li Yoon-mu, who used the assistance of the system and refining pagoda to obtain the secret of refining power grains. Because of that, flux experts who hadn't reached the peak layers would rely on their physical defense. Apart from that, they would also cultivate superior defensive limit training methods to increase their defense. But Wang Ru clearly didn't belong to the latter group. Her strength was mediocre and the room she occupied was outside the first 100 in the residential region 15. Being a noble, she also hadn't been forced to cultivate the limit training methods to become more robust and strong. Because of that, the trip was bound to be tragic for her. She had almost lost her life just then. Fortunately, Liu Zhong was a good person and his cautious action at the most crucial moment saved her life. The other woman, He Miao, quickly took off her cape and draped it over Wang Ru, whose body was exposed. Be careful of these leaf blades, which aren't like the usual plant matter. Given their sharpness and hardness, they can easily cut through your body. Li Yoon-mu extended his hand and placed it on the leaf blade. He used 60% of his strength and forcefully severed it in two, pulling it out of the underbush. Then he placed his hand on the edge of the grass leaf again. Instantly, he felt a headache coming. The edge of the grass blade had become extremely rigid, almost comparable to that of an ordinary blade or sword. It was also quite sharp. Among their group of 4, probably only Li Yoon-mu himself didn't need to fear being cut by the transformed grass leaves. Even Liu Zhong, who cultivated some defensive cultivation methods of physical flux experts, would definitely be bruised all over and end up greatly injured if he dared to move carelessly through the grass blades. As for He Miao and Wang Ru, the two delicate nobles, the situation was even more dire. As long as they were a little careless, their head and body could end up at different places. And there wasn't the least bit of exaggeration in that description. Usually the grass of ordinary tropical forests would only be able to reach a person's ankles, however in that dimensional space, everything was magnified by more than 100 times. The small grass which would only reach a person's ankle had transformed into more than 10 meters tall grass blades. In truth, there wasn't much of a difference between the jungle Lee Yoon-mu and the other three were about to enter in a forest of blades. A normal flux expert couldn't move carelessly there, especially someone who hadn't congealed their crystal armor. I will open the path. When Liu Zhong chopped each grass blade in their path, they made a ding sound like a forged ironware. Opening the path was extremely difficult. Lee Yoon-mu kept holding the rear. He had no particular target, since his only goal was to disappear from the sight of Zhang Chuan and the others. As for the scouting, he didn't care much about it and left all of it to Liu Zhong. In fact, he was aware that Zhang Quan's group knew about the circumstances of this island, so there wasn't any real need to scout. Without noticing, an hour passed with the four of them trying to penetrate the depths of the forest with great difficulty. According to the system's analysis, they had covered around 4 kilometers. After adapting for a period of time, the group finally heaved a sigh of relief. Apparently, there wasn't anything dangerous on the island, apart from the grass blades. At least until then, no vicious beast-grade monster had appeared. There hadn't been a single howl, let alone a monster. But suddenly, Lee Yoon-mu's expression changed. "Wait a minute, stop," he suddenly shouted to the front. "What happened?" Both women turned their heads, while Liu Zhong looked at him with a blank expression on his face. "Did you hear that? There seems to be some movement." Lee Yoon-mu didn't say much. In fact, even he hadn't heard anything with his keen hearing, but the system has detected some movement in their surroundings. No. After trying to hear something for a long time, they still couldn't hear anything. "Wait a bit more." Lee Yoon-mu remained unmoving. He was certain that the system's analysis of the surroundings was correct. Since it had detected many life forms in their vicinity, then it couldn't be false. However, even after waiting for another while, they still didn't discover any movements. But at that moment, Lee Yoon-mu suddenly pointed to the left. "I heard a large group moving with small steps over there." Clearly, Lee Yoon-mu's hearing was much better compared to that of the three people. After another 10 seconds, Liu Zhong and the others also managed to hear something. Their group began to look in the direction of movement as if they were about to face some great enemy. The unknown was always terrifying. That was true even if the four of them were flux experts who were considered as godlike existences in the eyes of the lowest rung people. After another 10 seconds, the system issued an alarm, and the life forms showed up. The one leading them suddenly pushed out its head from the dense grass blades. As for the appearance of the head, at first glance, it didn't appear like a monster's head, but it also didn't appear to be a human. It also wasn't close to the various tribes present in the origin world. It had 2 large eyeballs which seemed to be bursting out and some thick whiskers. Its mouth was filled with sharp teeth. When Lee Yoon-mu saw it, he immediately realized what it was. An insect monster. It was definitely an insect monster and not an insect, because of its size. The head which had appeared from the grass blades was around the size of a soccer ball. The unknown insect monster extended its antennae as if trying to explore the space, and the next instant, it seemed to have discovered something. It rushed out of the grass blade forest, going straight for Lee Yoon-mu's group of 4. "It's an ant." "My god, such a large ant," he meow cried out in surprise. The others also seemed to have made the same association, and their complexions changed. But it was too late. Suddenly, one after another, giant ants began to bubble forth from the grass blades. They seemed to have received some signal and rushed forth towards Lee Yoon-mu's group of 4. Their numbers continued to increase and all of them moved in a dense crown. Each of them was the size of an adult dog and would weigh no less than 100 catties. If the giant ants had only numbered between 10 and 100, they wouldn't be worth much of anything. But within a split second, their numbers reached several hundred, and there were still more of them coming. At the sight of it, even Lee Yoon-mu became worried about whether his absolute defense could last in front of the onslaught of the giant ants. Chapter 395, Terrifying Strength. By then, Wang Ru's body had already gone soft. It wasn't that her strength was mediocre, but that at some point in time, the numbers of the giant ants couldn't be counted anymore. Regardless of which direction they ran in, they discovered more ants there. They had already been surrounded. Don't worry, we still have ghost silk pollen which can control various insects. He-Miao suddenly remembered something and hastily took out the ghost silk pollen, scattering it in the direction of the ants. But the next scene caused everyone to fall even deeper into despair. How is that possible? Why isn't the ghost silk pollen working? Bang! At that moment, Yoon-mu took action. Seeing that the ghost silk pollen was useless, he knew that Zheng Xuan had definitely concealed the secret behind it. It wasn't that the ghost silk pollen wasn't useful, but that it needed to be mixed with some other ingredients to subdue the insect monsters in the island. Otherwise, Zheng Xuan definitely wouldn't have made a trip to Cloud Island. Yoon-mu kicked the head of an ant before him. With the strength of 30 oxen, his move shattered the chitin armor. After that trial attack, Yoon-mu became even more shocked. He needed to use 40% of his physical strength to shatter the chitin armor. It meant that a physical flux expert who had the strength of 15 oxen would need to use their full strength to deal with one ant, otherwise, they wouldn't be able to break their defense. So formidable? In a split second, he understood how dreadful was the island. The countless giant ants made his scalp go numb. The harmless insects became extremely fierce and savage in his mind. Previously, the threat from them was small because heavens were impartial and had limited their body size. However, the usual laws didn't work in the dimensional space they resided at that moment. One might as well ask how the ants who could lift more than 10 or even 100 times their weight change if given the size equivalent to that of a dog. After all, that exact scenario was playing in front of the group's eyes. Moreover, it wasn't just one ant or a group that they faced, but rather a densely packed crowd with numbers in several thousands and still increasing. We can't fight. Run quickly. We can only make a desperate getaway. In just one exchange of blows, the difference between the two sides was clearly displayed. Yoon-mu didn't use any flux energy and only relied on his physical strength, however. In 10 breaths' time, he unleashed Wind God Tornado Kick, and with each kick faster than the last one, his legs turned into machines of destruction. In the blink of an eye, 20 or so ants at the front were blasted away. By then, Yoon-mu's control over his physical strength had reached an astonishing degree. His attacks contained the exact amount of power that he intended to use, no more and no less. With every move, his kicking, thrusting, chopping, beheading strength was stable, exactly that of 15 oxen. Because of it, the ants rushing forth toward him weren't blasted away nor intimidated enough to retreat. His use of strength perfectly coincided with the amount of strength required to kill the ants on the spot, leaving behind their chitin shattered into fragments. Liu Zhong, who was the second most powerful person in their group and possessed physical strength of 21 oxen and 90 points flux energy strength, used his flux energy in combination with physical strength. He unleashed a fist and kicking techniques, both of which displayed extraordinary prowess. For dealing with one ant, he only needed to display 70% of his strength to easily suppress it. Within 10 breaths, he had already gotten rid of 5 or 6 of them. Among the flux experts, his strength could be considered pretty good and would be ranked somewhere around the middle. The most outstanding thing was that he was a physical flux expert before he started cultivating, so his foundation in physical flux skills was unusually strong. With his strength, he could easily deal with around 100 of the ants. However, in front of the inexhaustible number of them, even 10 Liu Zhongs would just be cannon fodder. As for He-Miao and Wang Ru, their physical strength was around 18 oxen and flux strength was around 70-something points. In addition to that, they had no foundation in physical flux skills which could strengthen their bodies. Thus, they had to use their full strength for almost every ant that they killed. On top of that, after panicking in front of danger, they weren't able to control their movements properly. In around 10 seconds, they had only killed 3 ants together while wounding 6. Yet they had already lost most of their combat strength. In no time, Wang Ryu and He Miao were in dire straits. They were unable to quickly get rid of the ants in front of them, because of which they couldn't move and got trapped. Soon, the ants surrounded them from all directions, forming a thick wall of several meters around them. Li Yoon-mu was certain that with their combined strength, they could barely deal with around 30 ants, and that was already an optimistic estimate. But the number surrounding them far surpassed 30. Fortunately for them, even if they weren't formidable and didn't possess strong combat strength, they still had Li Yoon-mu in their group. As the ants surrounded them to the point when it was difficult to make out their head, Li Yoon-mu moved like the wind and reached their side. He rushed the group of ants nearest to them who had been pulverized by Li Yoon-mu's kicks long ago. Calm down. It is only the beginning. After leaving with me, don't turn back and quickly run toward the beach to save your lives. The end result will only depend on your own selves. Violent blade, tornado kick. After advising them, Li Yoon-mu's moved again. At that instant, he also had a blade in his hand. He unleashed Violent Blade for the first time after descending. With each strike faster than the last, combined with Wind God tornado kicks as the main offense, Li Yoon-mu turned into a cold ant-killing machine. He felt nostalgic. It had been a long time since he had used Violent Blade. After all, Violent Blade's terrifying ability couldn't be well displayed in fighting against one person. It was more suited to his current type of situation. When there were a large number of enemies, its strength could be revealed. In the blink of an eye, Li Yoon-mu's combat ability was displayed to the peak with his usage of Wind God Tornado Kick and Violent Blade in addition to Insect Step. The Origin world didn't put stress on combat prowess alone, but strength as a whole. What was the difference between the two? Chapter 396, Birth of Extinguisher. Some people were powerful, but they were unable to unleash all of it. Because of that, a term like combat strength had come into existence. It measured how much power a person could use in battle. People who didn't have enough combat strength may not have learned high-level battle skills. But in short, they were existences who couldn't unleash their full strength, only able to display it like an elephant who shows off its tusks, but uses different teeth to eat. Li Yoon-mu, however, didn't lack in anything. He possessed Violent Blade, Wind God Tornado Kick, and Insect Step, which were lost battle skills of ancient times. Those skills were suitable for the unique dangerous situation he found himself in at that moment and would allow him to unleash combat strength which far surpassed his strength. For example, He Miao and Wang Ryu could only unleash 40% to 50% of their strength. Liu Zhong, on the other hand, could still maintain his calm. He had also built himself a good foundation by having been a physical flux expert once and gained a lot of experience. Because of all that, he could unleash 90% of his total strength, sometimes even reaching 95%. With great desire to survive fueling him, he could even force himself to unleash all 100% of his strength in combat. Then what was the percentage of Li Yoon-mu's strength used in combat? If numbers were used to describe his condition, then it was 300%. Yes, in that unique environment, he was able to display 300% of his strength in combat. What sort of heaven-defying monster was he? By then, whether it was He Miao or Wang Ryu or even Liu Zhong, all of them had cold sweat going down their back while watching Li Yoon-mu's rampage. They had never expected that the low-spoken person who had always tried to reduce his presence could be so terrifying. Looking at Li Yoon-mu's performance, all of them realized something when they saw him kill 10 enormous ants in 10 breaths. Zhang Yuan was far from being a match for him, so far away that he might never be able to catch up. Still not going, are you all idiots? Li Yoon-mu seemed to have grown eyes at his back and began scolding his 3 companions. In a few minutes, there were hundreds of giant ant corpses lying all around. Under Li Yoon-mu's 300% of combat strength, the ants rushing toward him from all direction were killed mercilessly, thus opening the retreat path which had been blocked. Then what about you? Wang Yu subconsciously shouted. Forget about me, worry about yourself first. Li Yoon-mu didn't turn back. He continued killing the densely packed giant ants rushing toward him. Wang Yu tightly bit her lip and said with tears filling her eyes, then take care of yourself, you must definitely return. It was fortunate that the path once filled with leaf blades but which had been opened by Liu Zhong could be used for retreat without the fear of being ripped apart. As they left, Li Yoon-mu, who had previously hadn't had much of a presence, already possessed a profound impression in their hearts. When the silhouettes of the three had disappeared, Li Yoon-mu breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't that he had suddenly become kind-hearted and decided to sacrifice himself for the three of them. His main reason for sending them away was that their presence was holding him back. It was especially so when he discovered that he couldn't use ghostly image substitution. At that moment, Li Yoon-mu had truly panicked. After all, he hadn't expected that there could be a dimensional space in the origin world which could suppress his life-saving escape technique. Until then, what had been the technique that Li Yoon-mu had relied on to escape from danger? It was none other than ghostly image substitution, which was a top-quality escape technique. He had 11 shadows in total, so it could also be seen as him possessing 11 lives. With that unique life-saving escape technique in addition to the existence of shadows, Li Yoon-mu had some confidence in being able to escape even from a sage flux expert. Yet he had stumbled upon a dimensional space which surprisingly suppressed his life-saving technique, which touched upon the void. What sort of joke was that? Thus, he quickly had the trio retreat. It allowed him to unleash his full strength against the giant ants. Get lost, I will kill all of you. After he was left by himself, he unleashed something which he hadn't used for a long time, Danger Critical Strike. This attack could only be used when Li Yoon-mu was in dire straits. It absorbed Li Yoon-mu's vitality, spirit, and energy, including his physical power, flux, dark flux as well as flame thunder energy, and world power. In short, Danger Critical Strike, just as its name said, poured all of his strength and soul into one attack. By then, how many times had Li Yoon-mu's strength increased compared to 2 years ago? There was no need to speak of quantity. Just in terms of quality, he possessed flame thunder energy which was almost at divine level. Because of that, he himself hadn't realized that Danger Critical Strike when used in his current dire straits would erupt with unprecedented amount of terrifying energy. A faint blade energy which emitted dazzling lights seemed to absorb even the sunlight in a 100-meter radius around him. His surroundings turned completely dark. There was complete darkness around him, without a hint of light, as if the 100-meter area had been turned into a region where light was forbidden. Only the blade in Li Yoon-mu's hand was shining brightly. It was lifted high in the air and was congealing all the power. Extinguish! Li Yoon-mu's voice seemed to penetrate many layers of space, sounding ethereal. Bang! As the coalesced power fell with Li Yoon-mu's blade, an extremely compact blade energy went down with it. The next instant, bright dazzling lights erupted in the forbidden zone as if a star had exploded. Brilliant shine covered the whole 100-meter radius in all directions. There was no sound of explosion nor was there any terrifying energy scattering around. Silence reigned for the next 10 seconds. And after them, there was no living organism present in the 100 meters zone around Li Yoon-mu. Right then, the system's voice echoed in his ears. Ding! Congratulations, host! Your Danger Critical Strike underwent an evolution and was upgraded to Danger Critical Extinguisher. Chapter 397, each with their own sinister designs. Right then, the system's voice echoed in his ears. Ding! Congratulations, host! Your Danger Critical Strike underwent an evolution and was upgraded to Danger Critical Extinguisher. After hearing it, Li Yoon-mu sobered up and returned to his normal state. Extinguisher. Li Yoon-mu, who had already returned to his normal state, was greatly surprised. He hadn't expected that the trip would surprisingly yield such an enormous harvest. The original danger critical strike was already considered as domineering since it condensed all of his strength into one wave of blade energy. When he was an ordinary crystal flux disciple, he could injure a gold crystal flux disciple using this attack. And when it had underwent an evolution and was upgraded to danger critical extinguisher, it became the weapon of a death god to harvest lives. Lee Yoon-mu wanted to understand what was going, but he was in extreme danger at that moment. After the extinguisher attack had fallen, all the ants in an area of 100 meters radius with him acting as the center had been massacred. But the several hundred dead ants couldn't force the insect monsters to retreat. Given the mental capabilities of the ants, they only knew how to act on instinct and couldn't understand fear or retreat. After the extinguisher had killed several hundred of them, they simply went even more crazy. It was as if Lee Yoon-mu's previous actions had completely enraged the ants, to the point that all of them had blown their bugle horns in succession. Instantly, even more ants appeared. Minor reversal. Seeing that, Lee Yoon-mu didn't hesitate in using the vitality stored in his body to use a minor reversal on himself. Instantly, the strength he had lost by using danger critical strike began to quickly return to him. The next instant, Lee Yoon-mu's body which was restoring its strength flashed. He divided into 2 and then those 2 divided into 4 and 4 to 8. Kill them all for me. Lee Yoon-mu had finally summoned his shadows from the mid-sea region on western coast of distant Blue Moon Island. He only left behind 9th and 10th shadows in the mid-sea region while Li Yun, Li Feng, Li Tian, Li Dai, Li Mei, Li Lan, Li Zhu, and Li Ziyi had returned to his side. The instant the shadows combined hands, the situation changed in the blink of an eye. They formed a circle to protect Lee Yoon-mu, and then each of them began to fight with the densely packed and inexhaustible giant ants in front of them. You all, protect me and hold on for the time being. Lee Yoon-mu, who was at the center, sat down cross-legged. Although minor reversal had restored some of his strength, he had used danger critical extinguisher which had used up all his strength in one strike. So how could his condition have been restored to its peak in such a short time? Truthfully, Lee Yoon-mu's present condition was only a bit better compared to that of physical flux experts. He could use physical strength of 20-something oxen at most, which was far inferior from his peak strength of 35 oxen. As for flux energy, he had exhausted all of it. After overdrawing the flux energy, regardless if it was Violent Blade, Wind God Tornado Kick, Insect Step, or any other flux battle skill, all of their effects were greatly reduced. Without the assistance of flux energy, even if they were still pretty good physical skills, their threat and effects were naturally greatly weakened. For example, Insect Step. If Lee Yoon-mu used this skill without the assistance of flux energy and only relied on physical strength, then not only would his movement speed not go as high, but he would also be less agile. The true insect step which was unleashed with the help of flux energy had countless variables in every step and allowed him to shift his body at all times, instead of just bursting forth with brute force. All the other flux skills were the same. Fortunately, Lee Yoon-mu's 8 shadows weren't influenced by his weak state. Otherwise, it would have been a disaster. The 8 shadows could protect him. It was equivalent to 8 Lee Yoon-mus in their peak state, fighting a united battle. That sort of collective fighting greatly increased their strength, making 1 + 1 equal to 11 and not 2. The situation had changed within a split second. Regardless of from where the ants were coming, all of them were killed by the 8 shadows battling together, thus creating a vacuum of ants behind their backs. Lee Yoon-mu used that time to quickly restore his condition. He first took out a batch of extreme-grade power grain and swallowed it without any hesitation. After eating more than 100 extreme-grade power grains, he could sense his strength returning. From the previously barely over then, it quickly rose to 20 oxen. Before long, it rose to 25 oxen, and after all the power grains were digested, it had risen to 30 oxen. After that, he took out a flux binding pill. Flux binding pill? Yes, it was a flux binding pill. But what was he doing with it at that time? The answer could be quickly seen. Li Yoon-mu began to rotate the flux energy in his body according to a fixed path to absorb more flux energy and began to draw the energy from the flux binding pill. That was right. It was the biggest difference between the flux binding pills of the origin world and flux energy crystals of Earth. The flux binding pills came from gathering the flux energy from the dimensional space and refining it, while the flux energy crystal was a notch inferior to it. It was created after the dimensional monsters absorbed flux energy and condensed it. Thus, the formed could not only be used to open the flux points, but it could also be consumed to quickly replenish the flux energy during battle. As for the latter, the flux energy crystal could only be used to open the flux points to increase one's cultivation and couldn't be absorbed directly to replenish flux energy. This was the reason why the prices of flux binding pills were so high. It could quickly restore one's strength at the most crucial time, which was equivalent to granting them another life. But the flux energy crystals were different. They were the reason why the humans thought of the dimensional monsters as natural concocting furnaces. Within the origin world, as long as any flux expert had some extra contribution points, they would purchase flux binding pills. Li Yoon-mu naturally also did the same. Although he was a newcomer, but he was more wealthy compared to what others imagined. He quickly used a flux binding pill. At that moment, after crazily running for roughly half an hour, 3 people returned back to the beach. They informed the others about what had happened in the jungle. When Wang Yan heard it, she almost collapsed. Chapter 398, Through the Siege to Rush Toward the Center. What? He remained behind to cover for you. Wang Yan felt as if she'd been hit by a thunderbolt. When she heard that Li Yoon-mu was trapped by a horde of giant ants and was unable to break out, she almost fainted. But her reaction wasn't shared by others. When Zhang Chuan heard it, his face faintly darkened. He had surprisingly lost such a loyal and deeply moral character who was filled with great potential and could have contributed greatly for him to establish his foothold. Zhang Chuan felt grieved in his heart and thought it was unfortunate, but nothing more than that. For him, regardless of who it was sacrificing their lives for him, he would only feel that it was unfortunate, but definitely wouldn't be influenced by it. As for Luo Honghua, she breathed a deep sigh of relief. In all likelihood, Li Yoon-mu was dead for sure this time. As long as he was dead, Wang Yan would remain hers. It was just a question of time. She would return under her control without Li Yoon-mu to distract her. Li Yoon-mu dying to the insect monsters was the best outcome. That way, she didn't have to conspire to kill him in secret, thus incurring Wang Yan's hatred if she were to ever find out. It was something Luo Honghua had been concerned about since she had decided to kill Li Yoon-mu. As for the reaction of Zhang Yuan, Lu Yanggui, and Lai Jun, although they hadn't started clapping and cheer in front of everyone, their expressions were extremely cheerful. A powerful member of Zheng Quan's side dying was the same as Zhang Yuan getting one step closer to his goal. After all, Zhang Yuan didn't want to share even the slightest bit of resources they would find in this dimensional space with anyone. First, he needed to get rid of the members of Zheng Quan's group, then slowly do away with the members of his own faction. After that he would kill Lu Yanggui and Lei Jun, which was the real end plan of Zhang Yuan. An undiscovered dimensional space meant that this place was without any owner. So how could Zhang Yuan share this gigantic resource and secret with others? Dying is good. Him dying is really good. This way the beauty will be mine as well as the whole island. Zhang Yuan had already started indulging in a fantasy. He couldn't keep his gaze from falling upon Wang Yan's body, following which his eyes traveled to the grieving Wang Ru and He Miao. I will definitely leave Wang Yan behind. It would be too boring if I was the only one left alive on this island. Haha, this Wang Ru is also pretty good. She is quite honest, so I must have fun with her later. As for He Miao? Although her appearance is inferior and her personality is somewhat cold, she would be able to provide me with another taste. TCH, these 3 women should be left alive. As for that Luo Honghua, it would be better if she died. Zhang Yuan was distracted, so he didn't notice that both Liu Yanggui and Lei Jun, who were standing by his side, were looking at him with intensity. With one look, anyone would know that they definitely had some evil tricks in their minds. Zhang Chuan suddenly spoke up, which roused everyone from their fantasies. We have encountered a great problem. Given that all the monsters in the island have become gigantic, even the group of ants has become a huge menace. How then should we proceed to the center of the island? Reaching the center of the island. That was the goal of everyone present. After all, at the center of every dimensional space, there was a boundary stele. The person who discovered an island and managed to reach its center and obtain the boundary stele would be recognized as the master of the island. Although the power of that master of the dimensional space wouldn't be as absolute as that of master of a heavenly world in their heavenly world, it was still nothing to scoff at. After a person was recognized as the master of a dimensional space, all the creatures in it would pay respect to them. It meant that if someone was able to become the master of the dimensional space, then not only the giants' ants, but all the living creatures on the island would listen to their orders. Naturally, even then the master couldn't drop their guard. If someone formidable invaded and there was a large disparity between the strength of the two, then the invader could kill the master and take ownership of the island. Naturally, Zhang Yuan and others knew about this. As for Zhang Chuan, although he didn't know the precise details, he had guidance regarding that. Rushing to the center of the island and being acknowledged as its master was his ultimate goal. At that instant, after swallowing 3 flux binding pills, Li Yoon-mu's physical and flux energy were restored to their peak. The 8 shadows had held on, providing him with the crucial time of half an hour. Li Da and Li Mei had died once during that period. However, Li Yoon-mu wasn't worried about experience points. As long as a shadow hadn't died more than 4 times in a day, he could use experience points to resurrect them. During the half an hour, the shadows had killed nearly 3,000 giant ants. Yet their numbers on the island seemed to be endless. They kept on rushing in from all sides, coming one another toward the front, which was an extremely horrifying scene. When Li Yoon-mu discovered his circumstances, he sensed a headache coming. Although the shadows were synchronized with him and possessed absolute defense and could be resurrected, for how long could they persevere? Regardless of how many giant ants they killed, there was no end to them. Because of that, he decided to change the situation. System, send out the 10-dimensional space eyes and help me explore the most optimum path to the center of the island. We will break through this siege, he ordered the system. Warning: the enormous trees on the island should have many types of winged insects hidden around them. If we release the dimensional space eyes at this time, it is highly probable that all of them will be lost, the system warned Li Yoon-mu. I cannot deal with everything, and compared to obtaining the authority of this island, losing dimensional space eyes isn't a big deal, Li Yoon-mu said without any hesitation, not abandoning his plan. Confirmed, the plan is being executed. After the system's positive response, 10-dimensional space eyes were released. One by one, all of them rushed to the sky and quickly entered stealth mode. They began investigating all the paths to the center of the island after receiving the system's command. At the same time, the system used the feedback sent by the dimensional space eyes to draw a map which continued to expand in Li Yoon-mu's consciousness. See. 3-dimensional space eyes have been destroyed by 6 winged insects. They possess extremely sharp instincts, capable of discovering the invisible dimensional space eyes. Alert: the most optimum path based on the first-hand investigation has been completed. Do you wish to take it? Chapter 399, Many Insiders. Alert: the most optimum path based on the first-hand investigation has been completed. Do you wish to take it? With the assistance of the 10-dimensional space eyes and its fast calculating speed, the system had soon formulated the most optimum path based on the current information. Yes, immediately. When Li Yoon-mu heard it, he agreed without thinking. Execution verified. Soon, a guidance path created by the system appeared in Li Yoon-mu's mind. It mentioned the various insect species present in different regions, detailed topography as well as the amount of unknown factors in each area. Everything was completely clear at first glance. The chosen path was considered the safest by the system after the first investigation. Perhaps, if Yoon-mu waited for some more time, the system could find an even more safe path, but he didn't have the time. He commanded the 8 shadows to break through the siege and dash along the safe route. Not only did he want to settle the crisis with the ants, but he also had to reach the center of the dimensional space before Zheng Quan's group so that he could be acknowledged as the island's master. He knew that Zheng Quan's group had knowledge about the island, so they would be even faster and more efficient. Yoon-mu's only advantage over them was that they had greatly underestimated his combat prowess. Moreover, it needn't be said that he wasn't fighting along. He had 8 shadows, each of whom was as powerful as him. With 8 such shadows joining hands with the person himself, their efficiency when rushing forth was greatly increased. The endless horde of giant ants was like a butter in front of the hot knife spearheaded by Li Yun and Li Feng, and was easily being ripped apart, allowing them to penetrate deeply into the island. The number of giant ants continued to increase, making the siege extremely thick. The closer Li Yoon-mu's group got to the center of the island, the more tenacious the resistance against them became. Although the spearhead formed by the 2 shadows was extremely sharp, the butter's thickness surpasses the blade's length, so the outcome was that the hot knife could only cool down. Something's wrong. Why are these giant ants so crazy? Why are they getting more and more desperate, disregarding everything to attack us? Following the path where the siege was the weakest, the party of human and 8 shadows had covered a great distance. But Li Yoon-mu could see that the more he advanced forward, the crazier the attacks of the ants got, which created a lot of problems. The system pondered for a moment and then put forth a data point which it hadn't spoken about before. According to the analyzed data, the closer host gets to the center of the island, the stronger mental fluctuations are emitted by the ants. What does that mean? Li Yoon-mu followed up. There are quite a few possibilities, the system said after some thinking. First possibility is that the main nest of these giant ants coincides with the center of the island, and thus they have mistaken you as a threat to their main nest, therefore they are attacking you while disregarding everything. Second possibility is that we are being viewed as some sort of heavenly treasure by these ants. As long as they can eat us, their strength will increase greatly, and so they are crazily attacking us. Third possibility, however, is the most likely. These ants should be able to realize that they cannot allow any human to be acknowledged as the master of the island or their freedom will be taken away. After some more pondering, the system added another statement to the third possibility. Given the third possibility, the system will define these ants as insiders for the time being. Insiders. That's right. In case of the third possibility, these ants, or perhaps the Ant Emperor, knows that if humans obtain the boundary steel, they will lose their everything. This would explain why they are fighting us so recklessly. Within Li Yoon-mu's mind, the system's voice became more certain. Hearing the system's tone change, Li Yoon-mu understood that during the brief exchange between the two of them, the system had received some crucial information which allowed it to be more certain about its conclusion. Then is there also a fourth possibility? Li Yoon-mu was feeling extremely gloomy. If the third possibility that the ants were insiders was true, then his plans would be greatly ruined. The ants clearly viewed him as their mortal enemy and would fight him to their death. He was convinced that no one would be willing to lose their freedom. Even if the slaves which were at the lowest rung of the origin world didn't have their freedom since birth, they still struggled to obtain it. The ants were also like that. Even if they were only a magnified insect, they still yearned for freedom and wouldn't be willing to place their lives in the hands of others for as long as they lived. Thus it was no wonder that with the fate of all ants at stake, the whole nest had come out in full strength. The fourth possibility is even worse than the third possibility. After speaking until there, the system turned silent for a long, not saying anything. Given how long Li Yoon-mu had been together with the system, he could clearly understand why it had turned silent at this time, halting their exchange. There were only two possibilities for that. First, the system itself wasn't certain and therefore didn't want to speak any more about it, so as not to influence his mental state. The second possibility was that it was receiving even more important information. Because of that, it had stopped communicating to concentrate on the other matter. Under ordinary circumstances, Lee Yoon-mu had encountered the first possibility many times, but presently, it was surprisingly the second variant. 10 seconds after the system had stopped the communication, it spoke up again. It has been confirmed that the fourth possibility is the most likely. Just now, the dimensional space eyes flying at the front have been destroyed. It was done by various winged insects. They belong to different species, but still established a cooperation and created a dragnet, making the dimensional space eyes unable to escape. Notifying the host that of the 10 dimensional space eyes, number 3 has been destroyed. Number 7 has been destroyed. Number 9 has been destroyed. Number 10 has been destroyed. The system's tone became increasingly more solemn. Hiss. Lee Yoon-mu took in a shuddering breath. Apart from regret, he only felt even more regret. He had 13 dimensional space eyes, 3 of which belonged to him while 10 had been prepared by Battle Sage Vega, and 4 had already been destroyed. Chapter 400, An Ant Breaks His Defense. In the origin world, which didn't have any science or technology, it wasn't possible to replenish things which he had brought from Earth. All of dimensional space eyes were extremely advanced technological products, so each one destroyed meant there was one less he could possess. Besides, from some angles, it could be said that the dimensional space eyes had even greater use in the origin world. Not only could they investigate and alert Lee Yoon-mu of what's ahead, they were like the system's eyes and ears. After all, there was no online network in this world. Thus, the only way for the system to obtain information was to use the dimensional space eyes. How formidable was the system's assistance? Extremely formidable. It could analyze and create a database from the gathered information. If the system couldn't gather information, then its ability to assist Lee Yoon-mu would be weakened greatly. After losing the dimensional space eyes, the system would turn into a blind person who could only depend upon Lee Yoon-mu's vision to gather information. Host, requesting you to make a decision quickly, the system urged him. For the first time, Lee Yoon-mu could sense anxiousness in its voice. Right, recall all the dimensional space eyes this moment. Finally, Lee Yoon-mu was forced to accept his helpless situation and ordered the dimensional space eyes to return. Before long, they returned to him from all directions. But even then only 5 came back safely to Lee Yoon-mu, 1 more was lost on the way. In other words, only half of the 10-dimensional space eyes had returned. If the 3 which belonged to Lee Yoon-mu were also added, then he only had 8-dimensional space eyes remaining. After they had returned, the first question Lee Yoon-mu asked was an obvious one. How deeply did the dimensional space eyes penetrate? Number 10 had reached the deepest. It had traveled around 638 kilometers. Based on the analysis of the data, it should have been the closest to the center of the island, the system answered. According to its previous analysis, the diameter of the island was around 1,500 kilometers. This meant that the dimensional space eye had covered 638 kilometers from the west side coast, where Lee Yoon-mu had entered the island, and it had been just 100 kilometers short of reaching the center. But very unfortunately, at such a close distance, that dimensional space eye was attacked by the native life forms of the island. Because of that, at the critical moment, Lee Yoon-mu recalled all the dimensional space eyes so as not to ruin the enterprise for the sake of one basketful. He was helpless in this matter, because if he continued with the investigation, the end result would be that all his dimensional space eyes would be destroyed. Such a sacrifice wouldn't be worth what the harvest could provide. At least Lee Yoon-mu had already scouted the majority of the path toward the center. He wasn't worried about this problem, though, since he was more concerned with the true difficulty that the system's fourth possibility presented. The insiders included not only the insects, but all the life forms on the island. It was likely that they understood the consequences of humans getting close to the center and obtaining the control of the island, so they allied themselves and were attacking Lee Yoon-mu as well as the dimensional space eyes that he had sent in. Warning! Lee Ju has been suddenly attacked by an even more formidable ant and lost her life. She entered the 10-minute sleep before resurrecting. Warning! A formidable ant has appeared among the giant ants. According to reports, its sharp pincers and mouth have the ability to threaten host's current absolute defense. Suddenly, the system released a series of extremely serious notifications. At the same time, the replay of Lee Ju's death began to play out in Lee Yoon-mu's consciousness. He could see that the sudden appearance and attacks of the formidable ant were extremely cunning. While Lee Ju was busy fighting against the horde of ants, it suddenly appeared from under her feet. Presumably, if its large pincers had fallen on Lee Yoon-mu's body, then the outcome wouldn't be as simple as that for Lee Ju. S.H.A.D.O.W who was killed would be resurrected soon, but he would be finished. This newly appeared formidable ant had a much larger body than the others ants. If the ordinary giant ants were the size of an adult dog, then the newly appeared one was similar to an African bison found on Earth before the Dark Ages. If Lee Yoon-mu got caught by its powerful pincers, he'd be torn in half even with his superior absolute defense. It was extremely dreadful. There could no longer be any doubt about how terrifying could a 1,000-fold magnified ant be. This was the first time that Lee Yoon-mu had encountered an opponent who could crush his defense even though there wasn't a large disparity between their strength. Wait a minute, not good. Suddenly, Lee Yoon-mu couldn't continue analyzing the newly appeared ant. His keen instincts caught a faint movement under his foot, which he immediately connected to Lee Ju's death. He instantly activated his Great Heart mode, and without thinking anything, burst forth using Spirit Pincer Step, leaping ferociously by kicking the ground. However, even then Lee Yoon-mu's reaction was too late. A black ant with veined patterns on its shell came after him and went straight for his waist with unrivaled fierceness. This sort of speed surpassed human body's limits. Lee Yoon-mu even suspected that even quasi-deities and battle sages who didn't have a keen perception wouldn't be able to dodge such an attack. Fast, extremely fast. Lee Yoon-mu was clear that on Earth, the instant a predator attacked an insect, then even if the time was slowed by 10 times, the prey still wouldn't be able to dodge their predator's attack or avoid its trajectory. From that, it was clear that when Lee Yoon-mu encountered the attack of the newly appeared giant ant, he was in extreme danger. In a split second, he was trapped. The large pincers of the black-patterned ant quickly wrapped around his waist and ferociously clamped around it. Ka-cha! While being crushed under that terrifying attack, Lee Yoon-mu couldn't help getting injured even with his powerful corporeal body and absolute defense. He was forced to cough up a mouthful of blood.